The conference hall buzzed with a mixture of languages, clicks, and harmonic frequencies as delegates from across the galaxy settled into their specially designed seats. The Galactic Fitness Council's annual summit always drew the most elite athletic minds from hundreds of worlds, each species proud of their unique evolutionary advantages. Commander Sarah adjusted her plain black fitness attire and tried to ignore the not-so-subtle glances from the other delegates. As Earth's first representative to the Council, she knew she was being evaluated from the moment she'd stepped off the transport. The whispered conversations weren't exactly quiet, and her universal translator was picking up every dismissive comment. "Look at how stocky they are," chittered a delegate, their mantis-like limbs folding elegantly. "Earth gravity is what, barely 10 meters per second squared? How could they possibly understand real physical conditioning?" A crystalline nearby resonated agreement. "Their bone density must be practically hollow. I've heard their strongest athletes can barely lift twice their body weight. Our children manage 4 times that before their first molt." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her jaw tightened slightly. She'd heard variations of these comments throughout her 3-day journey to the station. Earth was the new kid on the galactic block, and apparently everyone had opinions about humanity's inferior gravitational environment. The representative, a bear-like creature with steel-gray fur, leaned toward his companion. "I read the preliminary reports. Their marathon runners take over 2 standard hours to complete 42 kilometers. That's barely a warm-up pace for our elderly." "Perhaps they invited them as a baseline," suggested a tall ethereal whose translucent skin pulsed with soft bioluminescence. To establish the lower bounds of galactic fitness standards." Sarah made a mental note of each speaker's species and general attitude. She'd done her research during the journey, learning about the various worlds represented here. Gravity was 2.3 times Earth standard, which explained their species' incredible raw strength. There was a low-gravity paradise, but their evolution had focused on lightning-fast reflexes and precision. Was a heavy world like, but with lower atmospheric pressure that had pushed their species toward explosive power. Doctor, the elderly human scientist who had accompanied Sarah as an observer, leaned close to whisper, "Try not to let it get to you, Commander. Ignorance is universal, apparently." "It's not getting to me," Sarah replied quietly, though her fingers drummed against her thigh. "It's just educational." The opening ceremony began with great fanfare. Holographic displays showed stunning athletic achievements from across the galaxy. Athletes moving through obstacle courses like liquid lightning, manipulating weights that would crush most beings, jumpers launching themselves incredible heights in their high-gravity environment. When Earth's brief presentation played, showing human athletes at the Olympics and various extreme sports, the hall fell into what could charitably be called polite silence. A few delegates exchanged glances that clearly said, "Is that it?" Supreme Athletic Director 449, a cybernetic being from the Nexus Collective, called the assembly to order. Their voice carried perfect neutrality as they outlined the summit's agenda. "This year's theme focuses on cross-species training methodologies and the sharing of fitness philosophies. We are particularly interested in how different gravitational environments have shaped athletic development." Various delegates presented their world's training techniques. The demonstration involved moving objects that registered as small vehicles on the force sensors. The showed movement patterns so rapid they required slow-motion recording to be visible. The exhibited explosive power that sent shockwaves through the station's reinforced floors. When Sarah's turn came, she stood calmly and activated her modest presentation. "On Earth, we've developed what we call functional fitness. Our gravity may be lower than many worlds represented here, but it's created unique challenges and solutions." She showed videos of human rock climbers scaling sheer cliff faces, their movements fluid and controlled. Marathon runners maintaining steady paces across varied terrain for hours. Swimmers cutting through water with techniques refined over. "Interesting technique work," acknowledged a delegate whose species had evolved in low-gravity asteroid fields, "but the raw metrics seem quite limited." Sarah nodded politely. "We've learned that fitness isn't always about maximum output. It's about efficiency, endurance, and adaptability." The representative huffed, a sound like steam escaping from a massive engine. "Adaptability is fine, but when you're facing real challenges, you need real strength. What happens when your efficient human faces a crisis that demands raw power?" We adapt, Sarah said simply. This drew some chuckles from the assembly. The delegates' antenna twitched in amusement. Adapt how? By asking for help from species with actual capabilities. Doctor shifted uncomfortably beside her, but Sarah remained composed. She'd expected this line of questioning and had prepared accordingly. We have a saying on Earth, she continued. It's not the mountain we conquer, but ourselves. Our fitness philosophy emphasizes overcoming limitations through mental toughness, technique refinement, and efficient energy usage. Mental toughness, repeated the with what sounded like skepticism in their crystalline voice. An interesting concept, but hardly measurable in practical terms. The afternoon sessions continued with various species demonstrating their advanced training methodologies. They showed how they built strength through manipulating massive objects in their heavy gravity wells. They demonstrated their explosive power training using specialized pressure chambers. They displayed their speed and agility conditioning in low-gravity environments enhanced by centrifugal force manipulation. During a break, Sarah found herself approached by several delegates. Their questions were polite but clearly aimed at understanding how exactly Earth had qualified for Council membership. Commander, began the delegate, their voice carrying harmonious undertones, I'm curious about your personal training background. What would you consider your peak achievement? Sarah considered the question carefully. I've completed the Ironman triathlon several times, including once in extreme weather conditions. I've also done some mountaineering, including a successful summit of Everest. The delegate tilted their head, consulting a data pad. Everest, that's your planet's highest peak, correct? Approximately 8.8 kilometers above sea level. That's right. Interesting. The atmospheric pressure at that altitude must be quite challenging for your respiratory system. About a third of sea level pressure, yes. It requires significant acclimatization. The representative looked puzzled. But why climate at all? Surely your technology could transport you to the summit instantly. Sarah smiled slightly. The point isn't reaching the top, the point is how you get there. This seemed to confuse several delegates, who exchanged glances. The concept of choosing the difficult path when easier alternatives existed was apparently not universal. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed a pattern in the conversations. Each species excelled in areas directly related to their conditions, but they seemed to view these specializations as absolute measures of fitness. They measured everything in terms of raw strength. They focused on speed and precision. They prized explosive power. None of them seemed particularly interested in what humans might have developed that was different rather than simply weaker. During the evening's informal gathering, the conversation turned to practical applications of fitness. Horror stories were shared about various species attempting to adapt to alien environments and failing spectacularly. We had an ambassador attempt our low-gravity athletic trials, chittered the delegate. Their bone density was so high they moved like they were underwater, completely helpless. The representative growled good-naturedly. And we hosted some diplomats who couldn't even stand upright in our standard gravity, had to use mechanical assistance just to walk. The added, environmental adaptation is clearly species-specific. Each of us excels in our native conditions but struggles elsewhere. What about humans? Asked the, how do you handle environmental challenges beyond your? Sarah considered her response carefully. We train for adaptability. On Earth, we have incredibly diverse environments, from the depths of our oceans to the peaks of our mountains, from frozen polar regions to scorching deserts. We've learned to function in all of them. Interesting theory, said the, but theory and practice are different things. The delegate's antenna twitched thoughtfully. Have any humans actually attempted to function in genuinely alien environments, real testing conditions? We have some experience with that, yes. Such as? Sarah thought about the classified military operations she couldn't discuss, the extreme environment training she'd, the missions in conditions that would horrify most species. Various survival situations, extreme temperature variations, low oxygen environments, high radiation areas, unstable terrain. The delegates seemed politely skeptical. Their own species' achievements were so specialized and dominant in their areas that they found it difficult to believe that a generalist species could perform significantly in any real challenge. As the evening wound down, the conversation turned to the next day's agenda. Supreme Athletic Director 449 announced that there would be a practical demonstration component. Each species will have the opportunity to showcase their capabilities in a neutral environment, 449 explained. The station's gymnasium can be configured to accommodate various gravitational and atmospheric settings. The delegates seemed enthusiastic about this prospect. Sarah noticed the excited undertones in their conversations as they discussed showing off their species' capabilities. The representative approached her directly. "Commander, I hope you won't take offense, but I'm genuinely curious to see how human capabilities translate to practical demonstration. Your theoretical approach is intriguing, but fitness is ultimately about performance." "I understand completely," Sarah replied. "I'm looking forward to the demonstration as well." Doctor waited until they were alone to express his concerns. "Sarah, I hope you know what you're doing. These species have evolved under conditions that push their physical capabilities far beyond human norms. They're not trying to be cruel, but the reality is that we're going to look like children playing in an adult competition." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Maybe, or maybe they don't understand what they're about to see. "What do you mean?" "They keep talking about adaptation and efficiency like they're theoretical concepts. They measure fitness in terms of maximum output in ideal conditions. But real fitness, functional fitness, is about performing when conditions aren't ideal." Doctor looked worried. "Sarah, even with your military background and extreme training, you can't outmuscle or outspeed. The physics just don't work that way." "No," Sarah agreed quietly, "but physics isn't the only factor in performance." That night, as the other delegates prepared their demonstrations and discussed optimal gravitational settings for showcasing their abilities, Sarah ran through her own mental preparations. She'd spent years training for exactly these kinds of challenges, situations where the odds were stacked against humans, and success required more than just physical capability. The next morning arrived with considerable excitement among the delegates. The station's gymnasium had been configured with multiple zones, each optimized for different types of demonstration. Gravity settings, atmospheric composition, and environmental factors could all be adjusted in real time. The demonstrations began with impressive displays from each species, the lifted and manipulated objects that registered as heavy machinery. Their strength was absolutely staggering, their movements precise despite the massive forces involved. The audience watched in appreciative silence as they performed feats that belief. They took their turn in a low-gravity environment, enhanced with obstacles that tested their speed and precision. They moved through the course like living lightning, their reflexes so fast that even the slow-motion replays required frame-by-frame analysis to fully appreciate their technique. They demonstrated their explosive power in a series of challenges that sent shockwaves through the reinforced gymnasium floor. Their ability to generate instantaneous force was remarkable, each movement containing enough energy to power small machines. Other species showcased their own specializations: flexibility and endurance, adaptation to varying gravitational fields, and Nexus collective cybernetic enhancement integration. Throughout these demonstrations, Sarah observed carefully. Each species was indeed remarkable within their area of expertise. Their capabilities far exceeded human norms in their specialized fields. But she also noticed something else. Each demonstration was carefully controlled, optimized for showing maximum capability under ideal conditions. When her turn came, Sarah stood in the center of the gymnasium as the other delegates gathered to watch. She could hear the whispered conversations, the barely concealed curiosity about what exactly a human would attempt to demonstrate. "Commander," announced 449, "the gymnasium is configured for Earth-standard conditions. Please proceed with your demonstration." Sarah nodded and began with what appeared to be simple exercises. Basic movements, running patterns, climbing techniques. The delegates watched with polite interest that gradually shifted toward confusion. After 20 minutes of what appeared to be a basic fitness routine, the murmuring began. "Is this their peak performance?" she heard someone whisper. "Perhaps they're warming up," suggested another voice. Sarah completed her routine and turned to address the assembly. "Thank you for your attention. That concludes the human fitness demonstration." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, the representative spoke up. "Commander, with respect, what exactly did we just observe? Those movements seemed quite basic." They were, Sarah agreed. Basic human movement patterns adapted for general fitness maintenance. The delegate's antenna twitched in what was clearly confusion. But where was the demonstration of your species' capabilities, your peak performance parameters? Sarah smiled slightly. That was our peak performance, the ability to maintain functional capability across a wide range of conditions without specialization requirements. The uncomfortable silence returned. Doctor looked, and Sarah could practically feel his embarrassment radiating across the room. This crystalline voice carried a note of something that might have been sympathy. Commander, perhaps there was a misunderstanding about the nature of these demonstrations. We were showcasing our athletic achievements, our maximum capabilities. I understand, Sarah replied calmly. And I showed you ours, the ability to function effectively without optimal conditions, specialized equipment, or environmental controls. The delegates exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared assessment. Humanity's representative was either delusional or severely out of her depth. The polite facade was beginning to crack, replaced by what looked suspiciously like pity. As the demonstration session concluded and the delegates began to disperse, Sarah could hear the conversations beginning around her. Words like disappointing, limited, and perhaps not ready for galactic standard fitness protocols drifted through the air. She remained standing in the center of the gymnasium, apparently unbothered by the reactions surrounding her. Doctor approached cautiously. Sarah, what exactly are you planning? Because right now it looks like you've just confirmed every stereotype they had about human limitations. Sarah turned to face him, her expression calm but with something unreadable in her eyes. Tomorrow's field exercise should be interesting. What field exercise? The one I requested during the evening session yesterday. A practical demonstration of cross-species fitness application in uncontrolled conditions. Doctor paled. What kind of uncontrolled conditions? I suggested a light hiking expedition to the nearby moon's surface, something simple and recreational to build interspecies camaraderie. The color drained completely from Doctor's face. Sarah, please tell me you didn't actually suggest that. Why not? It's just a walk. How hard could it be? Supreme Athletic Director 449's mechanical voice carried a note of surprise as they reviewed the overnight requests. Commander, you've submitted a proposal for an outdoor excursion to 442C. This is quite unusual for a fitness summit. Sarah stood at attention before the assembled council members, her posture relaxed but alert. I thought it might be beneficial to test our various fitness philosophies in a more practical setting. A simple hiking expedition would allow us to observe how different species adapt to real-world conditions. The representative's massive frame shifted with what sounded like amusement. A hiking expedition? Commander, I'm not sure you understand the nature of 442C. It's not exactly what your species might consider hospitable. I've reviewed the environmental data, Sarah replied calmly. Rocky terrain, thin atmosphere, temperature variations, and 1.8 times Earth gravity. Challenging but manageable. The delegate's antenna twitched rapidly. A sign Doctor had learned indicated either extreme excitement or alarm. Commander, the atmospheric pressure on that moon is barely 15% of most habitable world standards. The temperature fluctuates between -40 and +60 Celsius depending on solar exposure. The terrain includes unstable scree fields, crevasse systems, and frequent seismic activity. Sounds like an interesting walk, Sarah said with what might have been completely genuine enthusiasm. This crystalline voice resonated with concern. This is not a recreational activity, Commander. This would be a survival exercise requiring specialized equipment and extensive preparation. Oh, I wasn't thinking of anything that complex, Sarah waved her hand dismissively. Just a light day hike, maybe 8 to 10 kilometers across the surface, observe the local geology, get some exercise in the fresh air. Team-building activity. The silence that followed was profound. Doctor watched as the assembled delegates processed what they'd just heard. Their expressions ranged from confusion to outright alarm. Finally, the delegate spoke, their harmonious voice carrying careful diplomatic tones. Commander, perhaps there's been a cultural misunderstanding. When you say light day hike, are you referring to some form of extreme endurance trial specific to human culture? Not at all, just a pleasant walk across interesting terrain. Nothing too strenuous. The representative leaned forward, his massive bulk creating groaning sounds from his specially reinforced seating. Commander, with respect, I don't think you comprehend what you're suggesting. In 1.8 gravity, my species experiences significant cardiovascular stress. Add the atmospheric challenges, temperature extremes, and unstable terrain, and you're describing a high-risk expedition requiring days of preparation and specialized life support equipment. Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully. Really? How much preparation were you thinking? For a safe transit across 10 kilometers of that terrain. The consulted his data pad rapidly. Minimum 3 days of acclimatization to the gravity differential, specialized atmospheric processors, thermal regulation suits, terrain mapping drones for safe route planning, emergency shelter deployment capabilities, backup life support systems. That seems like a lot of equipment for a walk, Sarah observed. The delegate's entire body had shifted to a posture Doctor recognized as extreme agitation. Commander, our species' lightweight bone structure cannot handle extended exposure to that gravitational differential. We would require powered exoskeleton support just to remain mobile. The atmospheric pressure differential would necessitate completely sealed environmental suits with full life support integration. What about the rest of you? Sarah asked the other delegates. The responses were unanimous and telling. Every species represented required extensive technological support, preparation time, and safety measures to attempt what Sarah was describing as a casual recreational activity. This crystalline structure seemed to pulse with concern. Commander, our physiology is adapted for high-pressure environments. The atmospheric conditions on 442C would require pressurization support that adds significant mass to our movement profiles. Combined with the gravitational challenges, we estimate a minimum of 50% reduction in mobility efficiency. 50% reduction? Sarah looked genuinely surprised. From just the environmental conditions. Commander, 449 interjected, their mechanical voice carrying formal authority. Perhaps you should reconsider this proposal. The risk assessment protocols for multi-species operations in hostile environments are quite extensive. Hostile? Sarah's eyebrows rose. I read the environmental reports. Challenging maybe, but hardly hostile. There's no active volcanic activity, no poisonous atmosphere, no dangerous wildlife, no extreme weather patterns. Just rock, thin air, and some temperature variation. Doctor watched the delegates exchange glances. He could practically see them reassessing their understanding of human risk tolerance and survival capabilities. The delegate spoke carefully. Commander, when you say you've reviewed the environmental data, what specific parameters did you evaluate? Sarah pulled out her personal data pad and began reading matter-of-factly. Surface gravity 1.8 Earth standard, atmospheric pressure 0.15 standard, oxygen content 12%, temperature range -40 to +60 Celsius, terrain composition primarily basaltic rock with loose aggregate surface layers, seismic activity registering 2.3 on the stability index, no significant weather systems, solar radiation 1.4 times Earth standard, no magnetic field protection. She looked up from her pad. Standard hostile environment parameters, but nothing we can't handle with basic preparation. Basic preparation? This voice cracked slightly. Personal atmospheric supplementation, thermal regulation clothing, standard climbing equipment, emergency supplies, the usual hiking gear. The silence stretched until the delegate finally spoke. Commander, what you're describing as standard hiking gear represents technology that most species would classify as advanced survival equipment. Really interesting cultural difference. 449's mechanical systems hummed with what might have been processing strain. Commander, in the interest of interspecies safety, perhaps we should modify this proposal to a more controlled environment. Actually, Sarah said thoughtfully, I think this might be exactly the kind of cross-cultural learning experience that would benefit everyone. Each species could observe how others adapt to challenging conditions. Very educational. Doctor felt a growing sense of dread as he watched Sarah's expression. He'd seen that look before, usually just before she did something that seemed impossible until she proved it wasn't. The representative tried one more diplomatic approach. Commander, while your enthusiasm for interspecies cooperation is admirable, the reality is that this proposed expedition would require significant resources and preparation time that weren't allocated for this summit. How much time are we talking about? The delegates began consulting their data pads and conferring among themselves. The numbers they were discussing made Doctor's stomach clench. "Minimum 2 weeks for proper preparation," announced the. "That includes equipment procurement, environmental acclimatization, route planning, emergency protocol establishment, and safety system integration." 2 weeks for a 10-kilometer walk. Sarah looked genuinely puzzled. "Commander," they said gently, "I believe there may be a fundamental difference in how our species perceive environmental challenges. What you're describing as a walk registers for most of us as an extreme survival scenario." Sarah was quiet for a moment, appearing to consider this information carefully. Doctor hoped she was recognizing the diplomatic minefield she'd wandered into. Instead, her face brightened with what looked suspiciously like enthusiasm. "That's perfect then. This could be an excellent opportunity to demonstrate how different approaches to fitness translate to real-world applications." The delegates' expressions grew increasingly alarmed. "I propose we proceed with a modified version," Sarah continued. "Those who feel they need extensive preparation can take the time to arrange it. Anyone who's interested in attempting the exercise with minimal preparation can join me for a more immediate expedition." Immediate? This voice pitched higher than Doctor had heard from their species. "Well, not today, obviously, but maybe tomorrow. That gives everyone tonight to consider their approach and gather whatever equipment they feel necessary." The representative's massive hands clenched involuntarily. "Commander, you cannot be serious about attempting this expedition tomorrow with minimal preparation." "Why not?" "Because it's extremely dangerous." Sarah tilted her head with apparent curiosity. "Dangerous how?" The question seemed to break something in the assembled delegates. They began speaking over each other, listing the various ways the proposed expedition could result in injury, equipment failure, atmospheric poisoning, thermal shock, gravitational stress, terrain accidents, and general disaster. Sarah listened patiently until they finished, then nodded thoughtfully. "Those are all valid concerns. Obviously, anyone who doesn't feel comfortable with the risk level shouldn't participate. But for those who are interested in testing their fitness philosophies in practical conditions, it could be very illuminating." 449 systems hummed loudly. "Commander, as the authority responsible for delegate safety, I cannot approve an expedition that presents significant risk to summit participants." "Of course not," Sarah agreed readily. "Which is why participation would be completely voluntary. Anyone who chooses to join would be doing so with full understanding of the conditions and accepting personal responsibility for their decision." Doctor watched the delegates process this diplomatic jujitsu move. Sarah had managed to frame the expedition as a test of courage and capability, while simultaneously providing everyone with a face-saving way to decline. The representative's expression suggested he understood exactly what had happened. "Commander, you're placing the other delegates in a position where declining to participate might be interpreted as an admission of inadequate fitness." "Not at all," Sarah replied innocently. "I'm simply offering an opportunity for those who are interested. Different species have different capabilities and comfort levels. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." The phrase, "recognizing your limitations," hung in the air like a challenge. Doctor could see the delegates weighing their options. Declining to participate would essentially validate every comment they'd made about human weakness, but participating seemed genuinely dangerous. The delegates' antennae were vibrating rapidly. "Commander, assuming for a moment that some delegates were interested in this expedition, what specific preparations do you personally plan to make?" Sarah consulted her data pad. "Standard environmental suit with atmospheric supplementation, thermal regulation layer, climbing harness and basic mountaineering equipment, emergency supplies for 48 hours, standard communication gear." "That's all. What else would I need?" The delegates exchanged glances that clearly communicated shared disbelief. "Commander," they said carefully, "the equipment list you just described represents what most species would consider minimal survival gear. Are you certain this is adequate for the conditions you'll be facing?" "It's adequate for the conditions I'll be creating," Sarah replied cryptically. Doctor felt his dread deepen. That phrase, "conditions I'll be creating," suggested Sarah had a plan that went beyond simply surviving the expedition. The delegate leaned forward. What do you mean by that? Well, fitness is about adapting to challenges, right? The real test isn't how you perform under optimal conditions, but how you handle unexpected complications. The silence that followed was profound and somehow ominous. Finally, the representative spoke slowly. Commander, are you implying that you intend to create additional complications during this expedition? Not create exactly, but environments like this have a way of providing natural challenges. Part of functional fitness is learning to work with whatever conditions you encounter. 449's mechanical voice carried a note of what might have been panic. Commander, this summit's insurance protocols do not cover deliberately enhanced risk scenarios. Who said anything about deliberately enhancing risk? I'm just suggesting that real fitness gets tested when things don't go according to plan. Doctor watched the delegates process the implications of this statement. They were beginning to understand that Sarah wasn't just proposing a difficult hike. She was proposing a test under genuinely unpredictable conditions. The delegate's entire posture had shifted to what appeared to be barely controlled terror. Commander, when you say things don't go according to plan, what sort of contingencies are you anticipating? Oh, the usual. Equipment failures, route complications, weather changes, terrain shifts. You know, hiking. That is not hiking, this crystalline voice cracked with strain. That is survival training under combat conditions. Sarah looked genuinely surprised. Really, on Earth we call that getting outdoors. The expressions around the room suggested that the delegates were beginning to understand that there might be some fundamental differences between human and galactic definitions of recreational activities. The representative leaned back in his reinforced chair, which groaned under his massive weight. Commander, I believe we need to discuss this proposal more carefully. The scope of what you're describing may be beyond the parameters of this summit. Oh, I understand completely, Sarah replied cheerfully. Like I said, participation is entirely voluntary. Anyone who's not comfortable with the conditions can stay here and enjoy the station's facilities. The diplomatic trap had been perfectly set. Declining to participate would essentially admit that their species, despite all their claimed physical superiority, couldn't handle what a human considered a casual recreational activity. Doctor watched the delegates struggle with this realization. They were trapped between their pride in their species' capabilities and their growing understanding that Sarah was proposing something far more dangerous than she was making it sound. The delegate finally broke the uncomfortable silence. Commander, if some delegates were to participate in this expedition, what would be the specific objectives? Sarah brightened considerably. Excellent question. I thought we'd start with a simple traverse from the landing site to the northern geological formation, approximately 10 kilometers. Nothing too ambitious. We could observe how different species adapt to environmental challenges, share techniques, learn from each other's approaches. And if complications arise, we adapt. Isn't that what fitness is all about? The way she said, adapt, suggested that Sarah had a very different definition of the word than anyone else in the room. 449 systems hummed for several long seconds before responding. Commander, I will need to review safety protocols and insurance requirements before approving any expedition. This may take considerable time. Of course, take all the time you need. Meanwhile, anyone who's interested can use tonight to consider their approach and gather equipment. As the session concluded and delegates began filing out, Doctor could hear the urgent conversations beginning among the various species representatives. Words like impossible, suicidal, and completely insane were being translated through multiple languages. Sarah remained standing calmly in the center of the room as the chaos swirled around her. Doctor approached carefully. Sarah, what exactly are you planning? She turned to him with an expression that was perfectly innocent, except for something dangerous in her eyes. Just a light hike, Doctor. A chance for everyone to see how different approaches to fitness work in practice. And if they all decide it's too dangerous to participate? Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then I guess I'll be taking a nice quiet walk by myself. Should be very peaceful. Transport shuttle's passenger compartment buzzed with nervous energy as it descended toward 442C's surface. Sarah sat calmly in her standard-issue environmental suit, checking her equipment with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this countless times before. Around her, the other expedition members fidgeted in their specialized gear. The final participant count had surprised everyone, including Sarah. After a night of heated debates, consultation with authorities, and what doctors suspected were significant amounts of pride-driven stubbornness, 6 delegates had committed to the expedition. The representative sat encased in a powered environmental suit that looked more like a small vehicle than clothing. Multiple redundant life support systems hummed quietly, and his movements were assisted by servo motors that compensated for the challenging gravity differential. The delegate was barely visible inside a skeletal exoskeleton that provided structural support for their lightweight physiology. Multiple atmospheric processors and pressure regulators covered their limbs like technological armor. The delegate, whom Sarah had learned was named Quartz Singer of Deep Harmonics, had required the most extensive preparation. Their crystalline structure was protected by a specialized pressure suit that maintained their optimal atmospheric conditions while providing thermal regulation across the moon's temperature extremes. 2 other species had also joined. A cybernetic being from the Nexus Collective designated as Unit 7739, whose mechanical nature actually provided some advantages in the harsh environment, and surprisingly, a named Whisper of Distant Stars, whose natural environmental adaptability was apparently better than their colleagues had initially estimated. Doctor had insisted on accompanying the group as a medical observer, though his equipment was nearly as extensive as the alien delegates. Sarah had assured him it wasn't necessary, but he'd refused to let her attempt this alone. As the shuttle settled onto the rocky surface with a vibration that shook everyone's specialized seating, Sarah glanced around at her companions. Everyone ready for a nice walk. The responses were muffled by atmospheric processors and environmental suits, but the general tone suggested that ready might be overstating things. The shuttle's environmental bay opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, revealing the alien landscape beyond. 442C stretched before them in stark, magnificent desolation. Rocky terrain extended to the horizon under a pale, thin sky. The gravity differential was immediately apparent as everyone adjusted to the 1.8 Earth standard pull. Sarah stepped out first, her movements fluid and confident despite the increased weight. She took a deep breath through her atmospheric supplementation system and smiled. Beautiful day for it. The other expedition members followed more cautiously. His powered suit compensated admirably for the gravity, but his movements were clearly labored. Moved in short, careful steps, their exoskeleton working hard to maintain stability. Quartz Singer's pressure suit added bulk that made navigation awkward. Unit 7739 adapted quickly, their mechanical systems simply recalibrating for the new conditions. Whisper of Distant Stars moved with surprising grace, though their environmental suit limited their natural flexibility. Doctor brought up the rear, consulting multiple devices that monitored everything from atmospheric composition to seismic activity. The route I've planned should be interesting, Sarah announced, pulling out a simple navigation device. We'll head north toward the geological formations, following the natural terrain contours. Should give us a good variety of surface conditions to work with. His voice came through his suit's communication system with heavy distortion. Commander, what is our estimated travel time for the planned route? Sarah checked her device. At a comfortable pace, maybe 3 hours, 4 if we take time to enjoy the scenery. The silence that followed was profound. Commander, his voice carried the high pitch of stress. Our expedition planning suggested 6 to 8 hours minimum for this distance under these conditions. Really, why so long? Because, Quartz Singer's crystalline voice resonated through their pressure suit. These environmental conditions require careful navigation, frequent rest periods, and constant monitoring of life support systems. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense if you need to do all that. I was planning to just walk, but everyone should go at their own pace. She began moving across the rocky terrain with a smooth, efficient gait that seemed completely unaffected by the increased gravity or challenging surface. Her movements were fluid, natural, and disturbingly fast compared to the careful progress of everyone else. Within the first kilometer, the group had naturally separated into 2 distinct categories. Sarah, who moved across the landscape like it was her natural environment, and everyone else, who struggled with varying degrees of difficulty. Powered suit handled the gravity well, but the uneven terrain caused constant balance corrections that drained power from his systems. His exoskeleton provided support, but couldn't compensate for their species' fundamental incompatibility with the environmental conditions. Quartz Singer's bulk made navigation around obstacles slow and energy-intensive. Unit 7739 performed adequately, though their systems showed signs of strain from the environmental conditions. Whisper of Distant Stars surprised everyone by adapting relatively well, though they clearly required significantly more effort than Sarah. Doctor found himself somewhere in the middle, struggling, but managing to keep up through sheer determination and excellent equipment. As they approached the first major terrain challenge, a field of loose rock that required careful footing, Sarah paused to let everyone catch up. "How's everyone doing?" she called cheerfully. The responses were universally variations of fine, delivered through labored breathing and obvious strain. "Excellent, this next section should be fun. We've got some loose aggregate to cross, and then the terrain gets a bit more interesting." Consulted his suit's environmental readings. "Commander, the route you're suggesting crosses an unstable scree field. Our safety protocols recommend finding an alternate path." Sarah glanced at the terrain ahead. "Looks stable enough to me. See how the rocks are settled? As long as you distribute your weight properly and maintain good balance, it should be fine." "Commander," antennae were vibrating rapidly inside their helmet. "Our species does not have good balance in these gravitational conditions. We require stable surfaces for safe navigation." "Oh," Sarah appeared to consider this seriously. "Well, there's probably a way around if you need it. Might add a couple kilometers to the route, but safety first, right?" The implication was clear. They could take the safe route and acknowledge that they needed special accommodations, or they could follow the human across terrain she considered perfectly manageable. Unit 7739's mechanical voice cut through the tension. "Commander, what specific technique do you recommend for traversing unstable surfaces under these conditions?" Sarah brightened at the question. "Good balance and weight distribution like I mentioned. Keep your center of gravity low, test each step before committing your full weight, maintain 3 points of contact when possible. Basic climbing technique, really." She demonstrated by moving across the first section of loose rock with fluid confidence, each step precise and controlled. Her movements made it look effortless, though everyone could see that she was constantly adjusting her balance and footing in response to the shifting surface. "See, not too complicated." Doctor watched the alien delegates exchange glances through their helmet displays. They were beginning to understand that Sarah wasn't just surviving these conditions, she was thriving in them. Whisper of Distant Stars was the first to follow, their natural grace translating surprisingly well to the challenging terrain. They moved slowly but steadily, clearly working hard but managing to maintain stability. Unit 7739 calculated their route with mechanical precision, their systems adapting to the unstable surface through constant microadjustments. His powered suit struggled with the loose footing, the servo motors working overtime to compensate for the shifting ground. He made progress, but each step was a careful, energy-intensive process. His exoskeleton provided support, but couldn't overcome their species' fundamental unsuitability for this type of terrain. They moved in tiny, hesitant steps, clearly terrified of falling. Quartz Singer found the loose surface particularly challenging. Their crystalline structure was naturally brittle, and their pressure suit's bulk made precise movements difficult. They moved with extreme caution, each step taking considerable time. Doctor brought up the rear, grateful for his extensive preparation and quality equipment, but clearly working much harder than Sarah to achieve the same results. As the group crossed the scree field, Sarah maintained a constant pace that seemed leisurely to her, but required maximum effort from everyone else. She occasionally paused to point out interesting geological features or to offer encouragement, apparently unaware that her companions were struggling with every step. "The temperature's starting to vary more as we get away from the landing site," she commented as they reached more stable ground. "Should see some interesting thermal effects as we approach the northern formations." Suit systems beeped a warning. "Commander, our environmental readings show temperature fluctuations outside optimal ranges for several species present." Sarah checked her own simple temperature gauge. "Yeah, it's getting a bit warm. Maybe 15, 20 degrees above what we started with, nothing too dramatic. Commander, Quartzinger's voice carried strain. A 20-degree temperature increase represents significant thermal stress for our pressure regulation systems. Oh, sorry, I didn't think about that. Do you need to adjust something? The question hung in the air as the delegates realized that Sarah was experiencing the same environmental conditions they were, but with equipment that was orders of magnitude simpler, and apparently without any stress at all. His voice was tight with effort and growing alarm. Commander, how are you maintaining stable performance in these conditions without advanced environmental support? Sarah glanced down at her standard issue gear. What do you mean? Your atmospheric processing system appears to be a basic supplementation unit. Your thermal regulation is a simple insulation layer. Your structural support is minimal. How are you maintaining functionality? Oh, that training, I guess. We spend a lot of time working in difficult conditions on Earth. You adapt. The word adapt was beginning to take on ominous significance for the expedition members. As they continued north, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Rocky outcroppings required climbing techniques. Loose surfaces demanded careful navigation. Temperature variations forced constant adjustment of environmental systems. Sarah moved through it all with the easy confidence of someone in their natural element. Her pace never varied, her breathing remained steady, and her equipment showed no signs of strain. Behind her, the other expedition members were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A species they had dismissed as physically inferior was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded their own despite vastly superior technology and preparation. The revelation came gradually, as the various delegates' equipment began to show the strain of extended operation under challenging conditions. His powered suit started displaying power management warnings. His exoskeleton required frequent calibration adjustments. Quartzinger's pressure regulation system was working at maximum capacity to maintain optimal conditions. Meanwhile, Sarah's simple gear continued to function perfectly, and she showed no signs of fatigue or stress. Commander, Unit 7739's mechanical voice carried a note of what might have been curiosity. Your performance parameters appear to be inconsistent with our baseline assessments of human capabilities. Sarah paused to look back at the group, which had spread out considerably as different species struggled with different aspects of the environment. What do you mean? Our data suggested that human physical capabilities were significantly below galactic standards. However, your demonstrated performance exceeds most species present under these conditions. Sarah considered this seriously. Maybe the data was measuring the wrong things. Doctors, struggling to keep up despite his excellent preparation, called out, "Sarah, how much further to the objective?" She checked her navigation device. "About 4 kilometers, we're making good time." The groans that escaped from various environmental suits were audible through the communication system. Whisper of Distant Stars, who had been performing better than expected, finally had to stop for a rest break. Their environmental suit was showing signs of strain, and their movements had become increasingly labored. "Commander," they called out, "perhaps we should take a longer rest period. Some expedition members appear to be experiencing significant stress." Sarah looked around at the group with what appeared to be genuine concern. Of course, everyone should rest as much as they need. She sat down on a convenient rock and waited patiently while the other expedition members struggled with their equipment, checked their systems, and tried to recover from the exertion. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Sarah appeared to be enjoying a pleasant walk, while everyone else was engaged in an exhausting survival exercise. His powered suit had switched to power conservation mode, reducing his assistance systems to extend battery life. His exoskeleton was showing multiple stress warnings. Quartzinger's pressure suit was working so hard to maintain optimal conditions that the cooling systems were audible. "Commander," his distorted voice carried a note of what might have been awe. "May I ask what specific training prepared you for these conditions?" Sarah shrugged. "Standard military preparation, some mountaineering experience, general fitness maintenance, nothing too exotic." "Standard military preparation," repeated Unit 7739. "What does that encompass?" "Oh, you know, survival training in various environments, endurance conditioning, equipment minimization, stress adaptation, basic soldier stuff. The silence that followed suggested that basic soldier stuff for humans might be significantly different from what other species considered basic preparation. Doctor, who had been listening to this exchange while monitoring his own struggling systems, finally spoke up. Sarah, I think you might want to explain to our colleagues what human military training actually involves. Sarah looked puzzled. What do you mean? I mean, Doctor said carefully, that what you consider basic preparation might seem quite advanced to species who haven't spent centuries adapting to environmental challenges. The delegates exchanged glances through their helmet displays. They were beginning to understand that there might be significant gaps in their understanding of human capabilities and preparation methods. As the rest period concluded and the group prepared to continue toward their objective, the dynamic had shifted noticeably. The alien delegates were no longer viewing this as a demonstration of human weakness. They were beginning to realize that they might be witnessing something unprecedented, a species that had developed functional capabilities that exceeded their technological advantages. Sarah stood up and checked her navigation device again. Ready to continue, the interesting part of the terrain is still ahead. The universal response of barely suppressed panic suggested that everyone had different definitions of what constituted the interesting part.